I'm Andy Murray, the Executive Director of the Major Projects Association. It's my pleasure to briefly introduce this event before handing over to our chair for today, Professor Tim Broyd. Today's webinar follows up on a report by Bentley Systems on behalf of the Major Projects Association and in consultation with our members. So firstly, thanks to all of those who participated on and contributed to that study. The report brings together two of the most important topics facing the world of major projects today, and that's the role of major projects in delivering sustainability goals and the massive opportunities offered through data analytics to radically improve project performance. For those of you who haven't read the report, you can find a copy of the report in the resources element of the Pine platform, and also one of my colleagues will pop a link to the report on our website into the chat window shortly. Those two key challenges facing the world of major projects are not easy. So firstly, major projects are inherently carbon intensive. And secondly, the data required for effective analytics is not easily obtained, as major projects span multiple organizations, each with their individual objectives and separate data strategies. That's why these two topics featured in recent annual conferences held by the Major Projects Association's members, and why we established working groups to tackle them, and why we've supported this report and the formation of a project data analytics task force. The urgency we face means the world of projects need to step up and deliver big improvements soon. And this report shows an aspiration for major projects to shift from being part of the problem to being part of the solution to addressing climate change and the nature emergency. I'm sure we're going to learn a lot more about these today. The format for today is a series of short presentations followed by a panel. Please use the Q&A facility on this platform to ask questions. You can see it to the right-hand side of your panel. And if you need help at all, then please use the chat facility to raise attention to our support team who will help you. That's all from me to introduce today, except now to hand over to our chair, Professor Tim Broyd.
Many thanks, Andy, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or good afternoon, or good evening. You never really know where people are around the world in the good old World Wide Web. We'll proceed pretty much as Andy said. I'm Tim Broyd. I'm Professor of Built Environment Foresight at UCL, University College London. I'm also the director of the UCL Institute for Digital Innovation in the Built Environment. And I've been asked to handle the next 3 or 4 sessions. In essence, we have 3 separate presentations followed by a Q&A session. I'm simply going to invite each of our 3 speakers in turn to introduce themselves and give their presentation. So first up, we have Karen Alford, who is from the Environment Agency. Good morning, Karen.
Morning, Tim. So just as a very sort of brief overview, I'm Karen Alford from the Environment Agency, and I work in the asset management, responsible for data and information, and particularly looking at how we can really gather and produce the evidence that we need to support our decisions in a way that we are confident. Just a quick overview of directors within the Environment Agency. There are a number of existing assets, but we also have a very large capital programme. It's actually increased over the next 6 years, double 6 years. So we have about 900 active. So my concern is that, how can we do, what is it that we need to do, and how can we do it everywhere? We launched our net zero strategy, and this is very much a public declaration of our intention to achieve net zero by 2030. So we're very much committed to reaching net zero by 2030, but also we recognise our role as both a regulator and an operator of supporting the country achieve net zero by 2050. I have provided a link to our strategy if anyone is interested in following that up. So if we move to the next slide. So we talk about the 4 C's, cars, commuting, computing, construction. And those are the 4 main areas of our carbon consumption. And I am going to be really following through on the construction element today. So for me, I have 2 main questions that I am trying to need to consider. The first one is, how can we be confident we achieve net zero? And how can we enable informed decisions about carbon? So I'm very much recognising in the past we have sort of been measuring progressive improvements, but the net zero challenge really does require a different way of thinking. And I don't know that we've necessarily got all of the answers, but what I'm going to do is just sort of share some of our thought process in how we need to approach it. Are we clear to the answers that the questions that need to be answered? And I think this is quite an interesting one for a large organisation such as ourselves, in that you tend to rely on the data that you already have in your estate, whereas actually achieving the net zero really does need to almost going back to basics, trying to track and understand the questions that you need to answer, right from your strategic objectives right down to operations and the way that we manage our projects. And this will help us to really define those measures, identify, most importantly, identify the data sources and compare against the existing data to find the gaps. So the next slide is really looking at, is the data defined and accessible to partners? So we procure through a number of suppliers. So what is really important is for us as an organisation is that we're moving everyone forward in a consistent way, using consistent standards, so that we know when the data is produced, that it's produced on a common basis. We have delivered a data requirements library, and our plan is to extend and enhance the data requirements library, so we have a clear, visible, accessible way of understanding how our data fits together. But as part of this, we've also been trying to better understand things like maintenance standards, methods of measurement, so that we can begin to identify where we need to be taking action. So, because to achieve that net zero, it's going to be the big things as well as the smaller things that we need to consider. Also looking at how we can improve visibility of the carbon factors, so that people can be very much making the right decisions and having that data ready to hand. The next thing we need to consider is, can our partners produce data to common standards? And I think this is, particularly, moving forward, that the whole sort of standards piece is really important here, because we're working as a nation trying to tackle the net zero, and we need to have common ways of doing things and being confident that everything that is produced is adding to confidence in the evidence that we're gathering. So having common standards, and this is just one, about how the data is formulated and put together is really key. Then we've got to think about, how can we improve asset choice and material selection? So we've been developing, we're in the sort of process of developing a smart object library, as we call it. It's sort of very much around helping us to look at how we can enable particularly the early design, because we know absolutely that in the choices that we make early on, and that includes to build or not to build, is very fundamental to our net zero challenge. We also need to be thinking about the design standards, so and the materials being used. So as we begin to build up our intelligence and the resources that we need to achieve the net zero position, then we need to have the tools that enable us to connect to those data sources in a way that the practitioners and the people making the choices on the ground have the right information. I mean, one of them, very important parts, because for me, I've got to try to gain that confidence that we have the information produced and delivered in a consistent way, so that we have the single version of the truth. And being able to have a way of measuring and validating that information that is produced against our standards is, for me, very much part of not only the digital journey, but very much part of how we can achieve that net zero, so that we know that we are making progress. We know that our supply chain and our staff are following consistent processes. They have access to the right information, and we're checking that they have access to the right information. And then really finally is making sure that we have the right platforms and the right access to information. And within a business such as ourselves, actually we have a lot of the technology that we need, but it's having the data, it's being able to enhance and integrate our data with the platforms that we have in a way that we can really improve access to information. And by improving access to information, we can be ensuring we're making the best choices, and we're putting the right evidence in the hands of the people that need to be making the choices. So I think that's just about it. I'm sorry for the failure in connection there, but I'll now hand back to Tim.
Thank you very much, Karen. As our first speaker, I think you suffered more than you should have done, though to me the presentation was quite clear. We'll now move on to Jack Snape from Transport for the North. Jack, could you introduce yourself and present your presentation, please?
Thanks. Yes, so I'm Jack Snape. I'm Analysis Manager at Transport for the North, and I'm going to talk to you today about our decarbonisation strategy, which is currently at consultation. There's a lot to get to, so I'm going to move quite quickly. But if you're interested in any of the detail, there's a huge amount that's been published online in the last week or so, so I'd definitely encourage you to take a look and perhaps even respond to the consultation, which I'll talk about at the end. So I'm just going to share my slides. Yeah, I'm going to focus on decarbonising the transport network across the north of England. We're mainly focused on operational carbon emissions, but I'll talk a little bit about embodied carbon in the infrastructure. I'm an analyst, and I've developed quite a lot of modelling and data analytics to support the strategy, which I'll draw out through the slides. So decarbonising the transport system is a huge challenge. It's currently the biggest emitting sector in the UK economy, transport, and the north is no different. In fact, the north is heavily car dependent. The level of public transport usage is lower than London and the south east, and there's also a huge amount of movement of goods across the region with vans and lorries, which contribute significantly to the emissions as well. The emissions from the public transport network are much lower, but it's still very important, and it's something that local and regional authorities have a bit more control over. One of the reasons that we wanted to develop a regional strategy is that there's variation across our region, and we can support our local authority partners to take different approaches depending on whether they're kind of largely urban, suburban or rural. And the analytics that we've done shows that the patterns of travel and carbon emissions across those different area types can vary quite significantly. So the strategy has been developed to support that diversity and make sure that decarbonisation can be as inclusive as possible. So we have a very ambitious decarbonisation trajectory. It's slightly more ambitious than the national ambition set by the Committee on Climate Change, and that's influenced by the fact that we have some local authority partners in the region who have really stretching, ambitious targets. Although they're mostly in urban areas where the public transport network can provide more options to people. But we have to develop a trajectory that works for urban, suburban, and rural authorities. So we've made it as ambitious as we reasonably can, and that is slightly more ambitious than the level of national goal setting. So we're looking at a 55% reduction by 2030, a 95% reduction by 2040, and a close to zero emissions by 2045. And it's really those heavy freight vehicles that take us that bit longer to get down to that close to zero level. We're also looking at the carbon that might be generated by building new infrastructure, so particularly on the road network, and we're making sure that we've got a decision gateway process whereby if we want to build a new bit of road infrastructure because we think that's going to meet all of our economic and social objectives, that we ensure that there are supporting policies to make sure that doesn't increase carbon and that we can stay below this trajectory that we've set ourselves. So we have a number of trajectories of what carbon might look like in the future, and our main decarbonisation trajectory, which is the goal we're aiming for. Now, Transport for the North and its local authority partners only have a certain amount of influence over emissions in the region, and there's a lot that's dictated by national policy, but also global trends. So we took an approach to managing uncertainty, and we've implemented future travel scenarios, which look at factors that are external to TFN's sphere of influence. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a second. And what that gives us is a range of policy gaps that local and regional authorities need to fill, which is shown by the maximum gap between the purple line, that's the sort of least ambitious scenario, and the trajectory itself, and the minimum gap between the green line and the trajectory. And we look at what policies might be needed to close that gap, and that gives us the kind of input material to develop our strategy, and it allows us to respond to changing circumstances as we have different national policy environments that we're working in. Yeah, we've developed an analytical framework, which moving on to the next slide here, the Transport for the North, which is a series of transport demand models looking at how things like land use, the distribution of population and employment, socioeconomic factors such as demography, behaviour, technology, working from home is one that's become really important. We can represent that in our demand models. And then we also look at how the transport network affects demand. So what does the rail network look like? What's the road network look like? How are tickets and access to those networks priced? Do we have a road pricing system? What's happened to fuel prices? And all of those things can influence travel behaviour as well. And then finally, we've been developing new tools looking at the vehicle fleet, so electric vehicles, hydrogen vehicles. But we're just doing some new work now on the infrastructure required for those fleets of vehicles. All of those things allow us to calculate the level of demand for travel, which we measure in vehicle kilometres, and we're looking at energy and emissions intensity, CO2 performance, and that allows us to calculate the emissions both now and in the future. So a huge amount of data and analytics goes into this modelling and calculations, and it allows us to help plan the transport network to minimise those emissions. So the next slide talks through the future travel scenarios in a bit more detail. I won't go into them now, but basically these are 4 plausible future worlds that could exist before TfN has intervened and brought forward its strategy as a result of national policy. They have different ranges across the economic growth, behaviour change, technological change, and national policy environment. And those lead us to 4 different baselines that we can build our strategy from. The next slide shows us the range of policy interventions that we might need to close that gap. The main one that varies across the scenarios is the level of demand reduction, particularly for cars, but also for HGVs. There are different levels of electric vehicle uptake that are needed across the scenarios too. I won't go into all these now, but if you're interested, there is a lot of detail available published on our website that you can explore. There's also a digital data dashboard that you can look at how the scenarios pan out in a number of dimensions. From that analysis, we've arrived at a series of policy recommendations around the need for electric vehicle infrastructure and grants to support some of the vehicles that the market is just emerging, particularly HGVs and buses. Obviously, rail electrification and rolling stock improvements are critical too. And we're also looking at hydrogen and supporting some trials around hydrogen infrastructure. On the demand side, infrastructure and other policy measures are key to supporting modal shift. We're mainly focused at TFN on rail, but we're also supporting our local partners in bus and active travel as well. Northern Powerhouse Rail is the big infrastructure project that TFN is responsible for delivering, and that's going to be key for reducing road travel in future, we think. We also think some measures around road pricing need to be looked at by the government, and that's quite a controversial thing that we've brought forward, but we think it is time now to look at that seriously, and we're talking to the government about that. And seeing if that's of interest, but we do think that's going to be a key thing to help manage demand in the future. And then moving on to the freight network, we're also looking at modal shift on the freight side, as well as the zero emission vehicles, making rail freight more viable, and water freight as well, freight SUVs to shift to that kind of thing. So we've done a lot of work, but there's a lot more to explore. We're looking around distribution impacts and whether people in low-income households are adversely affected by some of these measures and what we can do about that. We're looking at climate change resilience, adaptation, embodied carbon to the schemes that are responsible for delivering. Can we make them as carbon efficient as possible? And we also want to make sure there are some economic growth opportunities by stimulating the kind of competitiveness of the region in some of these clean growth opportunities. And we're going to monitor the strategy very closely as well. I'm running out of time, but really TFN's role is to support our local partners and to influence national government and where we're delivering business cases, to use our evidence base and our data and analytics to show that clean transport solutions can support the economy and really deliver the vision that the North wants to realise in the future. So yeah, I definitely encourage you to have a look at our consultation and perhaps respond. And yeah, looking forward to discussing this in a bit more detail later. Thanks.
Many thanks, Jack. Our third speaker, Lara Young from Costain. Lara, could you come to the fore, please?
Hi, Tim. Thank you. Okay, I'll just share my slides very quickly. So hi, everybody. Following on from Jack's presentation, what I'm looking to help deliver is to really bring to life how within Costain we have gone about achieving and setting out our pathway to net zero. So, and how data is a key part of understanding that. So my name's Lara Young. I'm Costain's Group Carbon Manager. And my role within the organisation, just a bit of context to this, my role within the organisation is to help structure and architect what we're going to do as an organisation in order to really achieve net zero and how we're going to go about this. But then also bringing to life the strategy that we roll out, so a balance between the two. For those of you that don't necessarily know Costain, who are Costain? So Costain is a smart infrastructure solutions provider. So we essentially work within anything to do with a major infrastructure within which meets national needs in the UK. So anything to do with transportation, energy, water, etc. Okay, why am I here talking to you guys today about our journey in particular and what we've done today? This is just to give an overview of how we've gone about this. I'm very much not looking to put forward one sole solution in terms of the granularity as to what we're doing and why we're doing things. However, whilst there isn't the same answer for everyone around net zero and how we go about it, the means in structuring and identifying how an organisation, regardless of the scale, size and industry, can do this is very similar. So I'm not necessarily looking to promote too much the solutions that we're put forward in that sense, but it's very much more the process of how we've gone about this. So in terms of that, the whole net zero carbon climate change agenda is pretty noisy at the moment within the construction and engineering industry. But what we have done is actually, this isn't from Costain's perspective a knee-jerk reaction. What we have done is, with the launch of our climate change action plan, which we launched at the end of 2019, we've actually built on our journey to date. So as you can see Up till now, whilst we've maybe not always been as good as we could have been about promoting and communicating all the stuff we've done, we've actually made some substantial jumps already over the last decade. What we do recognise is we need to do that a hell of a lot faster and address emissions that up till now we probably haven't addressed to the full potential that we could do. So just to frame this context around that, and to be able to paint the picture of our journey to date and building on what we've achieved so far, data has been a key part in informing that. So actually being able to articulate and understand actually where is your biggest bang for your buck is a really big part of this, to be able to inform where is your greatest opportunities to reduce both emissions and understand actually where is your biggest bang for your buck in terms of a priority as well. As much as I'm sure everyone would like to, one of the key things that we do recognise within Costain and part of our climate change action plan around this is we're not trying to solve net zero in one go or in one sole thing. Actually, we've got a climate change action plan, as you note here. You'll note it's not a carbon action plan, because we do also recognise that actually climate change is, whilst carbon plays a big part, it's not the only thing. However, what we do recognise is breaking this down so that it's accessible and bite-sized to be able to truly implement and generate change. So as you can see here on the screen, what you'll have is our climate change action plan. And this plan, it might look simple, and the idea is it is. We're not trying to overcomplicate achieving net zero, whilst the topic in itself is already complicated enough. What we have done is really break down actually mapping out where is our whole life cycle footprint, what does that look like, understanding where our greatest emission sources are, and then really homing in on those to be able to identify, okay, now that we know where are the big priority areas, what's the plan that we need to do in order to actually generate and drive that further, and then actually implementing those action plans. So we've committed to net zero by 2035 at the very latest. One of the big things around this is actually we're not just addressing Costain's part of our direct emissions, we are very much focused on addressing our whole life cycle footprint. So that NEN 2035 figure is not just solely addressing our carbon footprint directly from Costain, but actually a significant proportion is actually within our client and our supply chain's footprints. And so actually the targets that we have in this plan, 3/4 of those targets we cannot actually achieve without ensuring and helping our clients and our supply chains along this journey as well. So we haven't taken the easy option. What we have done is truly set out a plan that by following through on this will generate some industry strides and changes in how we do this. So what's actually in the plan? Well, actually, when we boil down at Costain's climate change or net zero or whole life cycle footprint, due to the array of activities and the nature of what we do, we are involved at every life cycle stage of a project. So it can be from very, very early concept design all the way through delivery and through to asset optimization, so optimizing existing infrastructure. And when we boil that down, actually, what we see is that our whole life cycle footprint is made up of 4 key big items. Whilst there is a plethora of things that make up our footprint, actually 96% of our footprint is made up of 4 key big areas. So what we've done in our action plan is really home in and take to town those 4 key big areas. That doesn't mean we won't address the remaining 6%, 4%, sorry. However, what it does mean is that we're really targeting and focusing on where there is the biggest opportunity to drive change and what needs to happen now in order to get the stepping stones in place to get to net zero by 2035. So what are those 4 key big areas? There is nothing that will come as a surprise. So there are no hotspots that we didn't necessarily know about. What we have done is really addressing that across the whole life cycle piece. So design is a pivotal part in addressing whole life cycle, whole life emissions reduction. So it's ensuring that whether we're advising on the design, whether we're actually delivering on the design ourselves, it's really integrating into our life cycle footprinting at that design phase, really understanding actually where is the biggest bangs for our buck, even on that project level, to understand and really take to town and reducing the emissions associated to that. So design plays a key part in bringing to life the carbon reduction opportunities. Materials plays a massive part. And of the 96% that these 4 items represent, this materials is about 3/4 of that. And very specifically, concrete, steel, and aggregate. So there's a huge amount that we are focusing on around really tackling the emissions associated to concrete, steel, and aggregate. That doesn't mean in time we won't look at other materials, but they are by far our priority areas. And with that in mind is what we've set out as an interim target between now and 2035 is that within the next 2 years, so by 2023, we will be providing with every solution that we propose low carbon options. So regardless of whether we're being asked to deliver it or not, what we're really trying to do is to help prompt and really bring to life where there's opportunities to incorporate carbon reduction. And again, this is all underpinned by having a clear picture of data. So in order for us to be able to identify and be able to put forward a solution and do this systematically across our business, we've had to ensure that we've got a very internal, a slick system that enables us using data to simply, but also in a tangible and consistent manner, identify where those hotspots are. So through the implementation of PAS 2080 has been really pivotal in ensuring we can do that. There's a big part where it's around car and fleet emissions. And that's not just looking at company cars. We've also set out a plan of what we're going to do for companies' cars, but also addressing the other sort of flip side of that coin, which is car allowance, because actually whilst one is a direct emission, one's indirect, but it's the whole thing that makes up our car footprint. So there's a big part around vehicles, but it's not all just around cars. There is a huge part around the plant and machinery that we use. And so that's really driving changes within what we're doing, be it at a very site setup early stage and when we're advising on how to roll out a project and when we're delivering a project to ensure that we're using the most efficient fleets possible. But also it's not just about using the latest hybrid or electric vehicle or excavator, which is great to do. What we're really ensuring is where there isn't an opportunity yet to use an electric alternative to the traditional diesel that we currently use, what we are ensuring is that regardless of what type of machinery you're using, we're using data from those machines called telematics, which informs how efficiently we are using it. So even if we can't swap out the type of vehicle to be more efficient, we can ensure that we are driving it in the most efficient and effective manner possible. So over the last 2 years, we've been really tackling and rolling out reduction in idling targets. And so we had a 20% last year, got another 20% this year. And that's making some phenomenal changes in just purely changing behavior changes as to how we use this machinery. Same goes for the materials. So whilst that's valid for plant, actually, there's a lot of low carbon materials that we can use, but where they're not currently available for everything yet, what we can do is also stop ensuring that we're not over engineering where it's not necessary. And then the last bit, so materials, design, vehicle fleets, and the last one is around energy usage, and that's valid for both permanent and temporary accommodation. And it's all very repetitive, but actually it's not just about looking as to what renewables we can, or what types of infrastructure we can put in place, or renewables and LEDs and stuff like that, and be on renewable tariffs, which is great. What we're also ensuring is using the data that we have from our energy profiles to address actually how do we reduce our overall consumption, not just the type of energy we are procuring. So our climate change action plan is very much informed by data. It's not my perception of the world. It's not someone's perception of the world. It is very much, what does our whole life cycle footprint look like today? And whilst that picture isn't perfect, our plan isn't perfect, no plan is, what it is doing is actually using the data we have to hand. And whilst that data isn't perfect, it does provide a pretty clear picture as to where we're at. And we will continue to refine that data so that picture will become clearer, but it's not hindering us taking tangible action now in order to actually work towards net zero. So how do we bring that to life? And I'll close on these remarks, is around the fact that whilst having a net zero strategy is great, and the hard part of putting on paper actually what do we need to do and how do we need to do it is one thing. The harder part comes now is actually following through on what we've set out to do. And we've made some awesome strides in what we've done over the last 2 years since the launch of our plan. But how do we bring this to life is very much through our resource efficiency matrix, which is a tool, and it's informed by data again and the whole approach, but it is just a tool. It's using the these tools to inform our decisions, which is really what makes the change. What our resource efficiency matrix does is it's rolled out across the entirety of our organisation, regardless of what type of market or project we're delivering, and really ensures that we focus and keep our focus. So we're keeping that consistency and heartbeat to maintaining and reducing emissions, regardless of what stage of a project we come into play at, on whatever life cycle stage that might be. And just recently, so since the launch of this matrix, the correlation of reducing carbon emissions has some genuine tangible cost reductions, in addition to a number of other benefits. Is that through the resource efficiency matrix to date, since its rollout in 2018, we've enabled to save and identify over £54 million worth of capital and operational costs. And that's not just for Costain, that's for ourselves, our clients, and our supply chain, and an associated 1.9 million tonnes of carbon emissions associated to that. So this really is driving both business opportunities, commercial cost reductions, but also truly and genuinely reducing carbon emissions at the same time. So it's not one to the detriment of another, which can be a big misconception. So where can you find out more information? All of this is available on the Costain website, and I look forward to the Q&A session afterwards to answer any questions. But yeah, the key things for me is, whilst there isn't one sole answer to addressing net zero, what we have ensured to do is using the information that we have within our gift today to understand actually what are the key big areas that we need to tackle, and then really building on those to continue and sustain that focus. This is a 15-year plan, so we're only in year 2, so this is continuing to evolve as we progress. So I'm going to hand back to Tim, and I look forward to your questions later. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Lara. Sorry, I was just dealing with a few emails that were inflicting my screen. Well, 3 good presentations, 3 people from quite different organizations. A few summary thoughts from me before we go into Q&A. I reckon we've been looking now in one way or another at sustainability for about the last 30 years. Not quite 40, but about 30. Looking pretty much through the 3-legged stool lens, if I can mix my metaphors, of environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, and social sustainability. And we've made progress on that. So we have techniques for seeking to understand the sustainability impact of new buildings through tools like BREEAM, and new infrastructure through tools other sorts of tools. These days, we're looking much more at 2 other topics. So I don't think we've left the overall sustainability areas, but we're looking increasingly at the sustainability development goals of from the United Nations, which are sort of nation-focused, top-down attempts to improve overall sustainability. And quite recently, we've started looking in detail at carbon, right? And both of these, but particularly the emphasis on carbon, has come as a result of an increased and necessary increased focus on climate change impact and attempt to reduce that. Now, this is quite new. So a few years ago, okay, maybe 10 years ago, when I asked the Highways Agency, I'm not picking them out as being bad guys or girls, but I do remember this, when I asked the Highways Agency what they thought their greatest contribution to carbon emissions was, they were quite clear. It was street lamps, right? They weren't interested in what was moving over the road surfaces that they provided and maintain. It was purely within their own tent, if you like. We've moved on from that. We're looking at the tools that we need now. We're looking at even how do we approach understanding what carbon is and what carbon means? And this, as one or two of our speakers have said, requires a much more integrated approach. So, in a rather brutal summary of our three, what our three speakers have said, and please, I don't intend any offence with that, we've had from the Environment Agency, right, a public sector developer and maintainer of, in particular, perhaps flood and coastal risk managed assets. We've had a message which is we are responsible. We are responsible for the carbon we in our schemes. And the question there seems to be, how can we help our suppliers to work with us to take a consistent approach to this? We have from Transport for the North, who are much more a policy-based organization. And their view seems to me to be the public are responsible. How can we help steer the choices they make in the travel that they undertake? And from Costain, as Lara said, an infrastructure deliverer and maintainer. We can deliver, you know. How do we work with our customers and our suppliers so that we can help or allow us to help you, our customers? I'm told I'm causing quite a lot of background noise. I get this from, I've had this from Andy for a while because of clothing I wear with zips, but I'm not this morning, so apologize if it's noisy. There is no paper by my mic. What I suggest we have now is a new scenario in which information is the common language, data is or are the means of communication, and data analytics is the grammar, and that we need all three. We can't survive without any of them. But we also can't afford the luxury of too many types of dialect. We need standards and consistent procedures and practices to allow data harnessing and use to be optimized, or at least to be used sensibly. I'd like to move on to Q&A session now, please. So could our three speakers join us? And also we have two additional people on our Q&A panel who I'd ask to briefly to introduce themselves. Anne-Marie Friel from Pinsent Mason and Prakash Pabu from McKinsey. So perhaps Anne-Marie, you could go first.
Thanks, Tim. So I'm Anne-Marie Friel. I'm a partner, infrastructure specialist partner at Pinsent Masons, and I particularly specialize in data sharing, and I also sit on the Net Zero Infrastructure Industry Coalition Steering Group, where we just actually released a really interesting report, which was led by Skanska on embodied carbon, which came up with a lot of conclusions on the kind of data sharing that's going to be needed and some of the current constraints that are happening across industry in terms of quality of data and so on, that actually prevent some of these really brilliant ambitions that we've heard by the three speakers who've already spoken today.
Thank you, Prakash.
Great. Hi, everyone. Great to be with you today. I'm Prakash Pabu. I'm a partner in McKinsey. I lead all of our work in how to bring data and analytics into the world of capital projects. Capital projects are incredibly data rich. We do almost nothing with the data today. And really, we're trying to kind of harness that data to just make even the life cycle of the actual build a lot more efficient. And there's a lot that can be done. So happy to share some thoughts with you today.
Thank you. And Prakash, welcome from Johannesburg.
Thank you very much. It's a beautiful winter day with lots of sunshine.
Yeah, I wish I could say the same. But there you go. Invitation, please, to dear people. Please post your questions through the Q&A box we have. we have one or two already up there. And my role, I think, here is to monitor the questions and then try and get someone to answer them, or maybe more than one. So we'll start with one from Esther Gordon-Smith, who's saying, are you looking at CO2 emissions or consumption? For example, a car manufactured outside the UK and then shipped in, those emissions are not captured in emission figures. Do we know the difference between urban and rural emissions, or urban and rural consumption? Jack, I wonder if you're the right person for me to point this at initially.
Yeah, happy to take this one. So we do primarily look at emissions from the tailpipe, because the further away you go from that, the more uncertainties there are. And in terms of direct policy influence, it's mainly around the amount of demand that there is and how much vehicles travel and so on. But that said, we do think it's really important to look at embodied carbon in both the infrastructure and in the vehicles. And I think increasingly using vehicles more efficiently is going to be really important. And within the strategy, we have recommendations around use of mobility as a service, car clubs, essentially things that allow the same vehicle to be used by many more people, and therefore the embodied emissions associated with every kilometre travelled will be significantly lower. I think that sort of thing is a no-brainer really, and will help with material efficiency and lots of other factors. In terms of urban versus rural, the people who live in rural areas do tend to travel further and have fewer public transport options. So you do see kind of, at the moment, higher emissions per person. And that's not to kind of, make people who live in rural areas feel bad about that. It just means we need a different set of solutions to make sure everyone can get to zero. So we might need more on-demand public transport that can respond to people who are living in dispersed areas. And we also need to be able to supply for kind of big influxes of visitors who will come in the summer months to rural areas. So electric vehicle charging for those big influxes of people we're looking at. So hopefully that answers the question. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. Could I ask you? I mean, you spoke about sort of corporate transport carbon. Do Costain take note of the difference between what in buildings I would call embodied and operational carbon?
Yeah, so a big part of our footprint is actually looking to address not just the operational emissions, which do play a big part, but actually materials and the embodied emissions associated to, be it whether we're designing it or advising on a design, or if we're actually the ones delivering it. So yeah, there is a very big focus on both of those sides of both of those elements of the whole life cycle footprint. The key part that we're working within the organisation to do is actually not try and confuse necessarily between what's embodied, what's operational. It's more trying to translate to individuals, depending on what bit they're relevant or they have influence over, as to what that means to what does carbon reduction mean in their world. So if you're a QS or you're a designer, whilst you might not always know every bit around embodied materials or embodied carbon footprints and operational, understanding what does that translate to in their worlds, for example, even from a commercial perspective as well. So yes, we do focus on both. We're not trying to make everyone, however, a carbon expert on carbon accounting around the different scopes. We are very much more focused on trying to make everyone have an appreciation for it, but also making it accessible for them in their worlds, really. And
Thank you. Anne-Marie.
What I would call the indirect emissions, scope 3. I just thought I'd do a bit of a plug, actually, just in case people haven't heard of it, for the new Cabinet Office PPN notice, which will apply to all public contracts over £5 million from September this year. And actually, as well as you're going to, it's mandatory, so suppliers won't be able to opt out. You will need to commit to net zero, but in terms of the actual information that you're going to need to disclose on your emissions, as part of your carbon reduction plan that you're going to need to put in with your bid includes your current scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, but also a defined subset of scope 3 emissions. So that's actually going to require you to bring your supply chain along with you, even if you're a tier 1 supplier like Costain. Obviously, you're going to need to bring all your tier 1, your next layer down and the layer beneath them. And I think that's going to be with a really difficult challenge. Actually, is going to require a lot of collaboration across industry to bring everybody up to the same place.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Just for information to the panel, I'm trying to monitor the Q&A and the internal chat between us simultaneously. So forgive me if I miss a note, and yeah, please do put your hand up as Anne-Marie just did. Lara, you seem to be quite popular from questioners at the moment. So whilst you're answering this one, I would ask attendees, please do maybe think up some questions that don't all have to be answered by Lara, because otherwise it'd be quite unfair on her and the rest of the panel. So here's one from John Ryan.
Mm-hmm.
Whilst you have control over your own CO2 emissions,
yeah,
in the form of how Costain provides the work for clients, how to have an efficient vehicle fleet, etc., what are you seeing in terms of carbon dioxide emission reduction requirements from your clients? E.g., what materials are making the biggest reductions with minimal cost differences? And are there any other big wins with them?
Yeah, I think the whole industry is definitely, there's a growing immaturity around what we're actually focusing on. The carbon targets that we're being set actually are far more explicit in actually homing in on what is most relevant to focus on, whilst there's still a way to go in terms of understanding and that maturity growing. So we're definitely seeing more of a push towards actually delivering on it. I think we will see very quickly financial incentives behind the carbon targets so that actually they don't fall off the radar as soon as it gets a bit more tight or constraints. And we are, you know, the way that our contracts are being shaped is actually being influenced and encouraging reductions to be delivered. I think there's a big part at the moment that's kind of not there yet, but hopefully will come soon, is around, whilst we're being asked around setting all these commitments and targets, there's a big piece around actually assuring that we follow through. And that's valid across the whole value chain. But actually, with all the best intentions, there is still a need to ensure that we actually deliver on what we say we're going to do in the first place. So I think we'll see that over the next coming years and months around that. It's probably one that actually Jack and Karen and even Anne-Marie, from what you're saying, Pradesh, can all answer as well from their perspective around how they're seeing it. Because I think it's changing at all levels, whether it's legal, commercial. Yeah.
Thank you, Lara. You notice you fingered as such some of your colleague panelists. Would everyone else like to take that up?
I'll say a word or two just on the contracts, because you mentioned it. We are seeing some pretty punchy obligations going into major projects around carbon. I think in terms of innovation around materials, that's a really interesting point, because I think, and I heard, I think it was National Grid who did a very fascinating talk I was lucky to attend on their TCFD process, and they're a real exemplar on TCFD disclosure. And for anyone who doesn't know what that means, that's the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, just so I'm not accused of using jargon. I think when you are asking your suppliers to use innovative material, that requires you to think about how the risk of that material will be shared in your contracts. It actually goes to the heart of really important issues like defects, liability under construction contracts. And so you do need to be prepared to go on the journey with your suppliers. Yep.
I mean, there is also, though, some contradiction in government intent in this. I'm not knocking the government, but these things tend to happen in that the government policies on efficiency of production and increasing productivity tend more towards taking a standard approach to element sizes, be it columns or beams or whatever in buildings, that don't necessarily agree with a need to reduce carbon. Right? Because if you're using a consistent size, then it's tended to be sized at the requirement for the largest of its type. certainly rather than the smallest. There's good reason for that. But you get these sort of contradictions, and I think we're bound to have to live with them and work them through. Prakash.
Yeah, Tim, just building on that a little bit, right? This is a journey we've been on with many of our clients on the notion of design optimization more broadly. The current practice today, and I'm certainly more familiar with industrial projects than social infrastructure, but the general practice today is we design something and then we cost it and then we come back and value engineer. And that's a very inefficient process. It typically doesn't lead to the right level of design optimization. And I think as we incorporate as part of design optimization, sustainability more broadly, but also carbon footprint, that same approach needs to change from I've designed it, let me understand the footprint of it, and then try and optimize it, to actually let me understand the big drivers of the footprint before I start the design across the full life cycle, and then I design with that in mind all the way. And that'll have two benefits. It won't only have a benefit on the carbon footprint, but it'll also have a benefit on optimizing the economic viability and the social viability of those designs. And we've certainly seen when that gets flipped around, when you actually start with the value drivers and the modeling, and then lead the design off that, you almost always get better project outcomes.
Okay, thank you. Karen.
Yeah, I'll take that. I think it's a very interesting one. And, within our organisation, there are a number of activities and initiatives underway which actually all do link together. So from a government client perspective, things like modern methods for construction, looking at how we can do things smarter. We have, looking at how we can use sort of more natural ways of managing floodwater, for an example. And I think the premise that we're really trying to get to now is that, we've got to challenge ourselves whether we need to build. And if we do need to build, where do we need to build to optimise the outcome? So I think it can be quite difficult just looking at things in a sort of siloed approach. It is that sort of the whole piece. And the area that we are strengthening is around our engineering standards, because we recognise very much that, as you described, Tim, it's belt and braces. Let's prevent anything happening in the future, but actually that's not really where we're going to go. So I think for a business, an engineering business, there are a number of things, and it's actually recognising how they all fit together to achieve that.
Thank you. Let's move on to another question. Anne-Marie, as a lawyer, what do you think we need in terms of new legislation to, the question says, to make all of this happen? Let's say to just to improve things.
Well, the answer is not necessarily all legislation. I think that the focus is going to be on incentives, which are not necessarily legislation, at least in the short to medium term. And we've already got quite a lot of good examples of these. We've got the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which I mentioned earlier. Now that's having a huge impact, and as I understand it, the eventual plan is that this is going to apply to all companies with 500 employees or over. And I can't stress what an incentive this is going to be, because you can't disclose something unless you actually have something to disclose. So this is it's not the TCFD. It's an incentive, but it's not actually the thing that's driving the action. You've got to be doing things on the ground in order to have something meaningful to say. And if you don't, at the moment, things are happening in quite an embryonic way, I would say, and companies are at different levels of maturity in terms of what they've got to disclose and the way that they've got to disclose. But I think over time, we'll see the expectation of investors and shareholders and companies growing in terms of the level of maturity that companies are expected to show on their TCFD disclosure. I think you've also got things like, as I described on the public sector side of infrastructure, which a lot of us in the MPA are heavily involved in. You've got this Cabinet Office PPN. I think you're going to have something that's a little bit like the prompt payment code in terms of if you don't, it's going to be very, very persuasive, just like the prompt payment code is, where if you if you can't show that you're at a certain level of emissions,
Yep.
you're just not going to get the work. So I think these kinds of things are going to come in. It does feel a little bit inevitable to me that there may be some further legislation that's brought in. Maybe it will be something like what we're seeing at the moment on building safety, where you have this, you're going to have to do a information model and effectively be regulated before you start construction. I could imagine that something like that might work, but there's no sort of hint that we're getting that that's coming in yet. But I could imagine that might be the sort of thing that comes in over time.
Yeah. Lara.
On that note, just building on that, whilst I think there can be a little bit of chicken and egg around the legislation and what pushes it, and I do think there's definitely a need for more reinforcing legislation around this, I don't think that should and will hinder genuine progress around accelerating net zero, because actually this is not just becoming a nice to do or something that actually we need to maintain. It's actually become business critical. So actually not addressing that now, not having a structure in place, doesn't mean we need to have all the answers right now. We do need to be required to be on that trajectory to be eligible to tender in 2-3 years time anyway. So there's a real drive around actually, and I think the harsh fact of understanding actually some organizations that don't actually genuinely take this on might cease to exist due to the fact that they haven't addressed it. So for me, there is, whilst legislation will significantly help, there is also, I think, a legitimate move towards this becoming a business imperative. So it's no longer an additional service that's provided, but actually it needs to be integrated into how you set up your contracts, how you procure, not just the quick wins.
You're spot on, Lara, because if you can't win any work, if you can't raise any money, and if your shareholders are hauling you over the coals, all of this is more influential, I would suggest, than almost anything you can get. I'm not saying there won't be another layer, maybe of detail, particularly in some industries, that's introduced, but I think those things alone are hugely, hugely influential.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else? I see no more hands. Right. Let's drag you back to the topic of this event, the quest for net zero using data leadership, and in particular data. From Karen, we heard how the Environment Agency are taking a lead for projects and assets under their control, right? Now, Lara, of course, Costain works widely in the infrastructure sector or sectors. So you'll have a range of different clients and customers with different needs, etc. I mentioned that information is becoming the common language, and we need the right words, we need the right syntax to help everyone. How do you think we go about getting these standards that go across industry sectors? And who needs to take a lead on this? Prakash, I saw a couple of fingers nicely. Not
yeah, sure. So happy to take a stab at this on the basis of an analogy from just bringing, data and data usage into projects more broadly, right? What we've seen looking around the world is, because the world of projects is incredibly fragmented, all the way from the mega corporation maybe building something, or the government building something, to the prime contractor, to then ultimately the mom and pop shops who do the final fitting, right? Because you've got this extreme range in sizes of players in the space and the high degree of fragmentation, it's very difficult to create a common data platform for everybody to work off, right? And so the most successful examples we've seen, for instance, in the uptake of 5D BIM have actually been in the UK, where it was mandated by government for infrastructure projects, right? And that forced the industry to adopt this, starting with the big players and then rolling down. In the absence of a government actually mandating this, we have just not seen the same level of uptake and standardization of almost any technologies, never mind just kind of carbon accounting, but just technology in general across the industry, across the rest of the world. And so this notion of government being a big investor and therefore being able to make a big difference in the way that projects are thought about, the way you measure them, the way you use data, we would argue that they certainly need to be a leader in this space. What we are starting to see is some of the mega corporations are starting to head in this direction where they weren't that interested in this 5 years ago or even 2 years ago. We're now having an increasing level of dialogue around, actually, how do I think about this? How do I manage my supply chain? In industrial projects, I've got modules coming in from Vietnam and China and the US Gulf Coast. I need to bring these all together. How do I think about that? So the dialogue is starting, but certainly where we've seen this be most successful across other segments of projects, it's been government-led.
Anne-Marie, thank you, Prakash.
I just talked about building safety, and I'm just going to use it as a case study. I know it's a really different topic, but it's interesting because we're about to just experience this in a really big way in residential buildings as a result of the new law that's coming in. And I think it's going to be all of the same things about what are the asset information requirements, how are we going to get them from our suppliers, and currently it's just not done. So I think that will be a very interesting thing for us to all watch and see how it transpires on building safety, where it is going to be made primary legislation, and think about what lessons can we learn from that we could apply to decarbonisation. I know it feels a bit different, but actually they're going to have a lot of similar challenges. And actually, just one more flag, in the UK, projects like the ICE Carbon project are also trying to do a lot. So there is, I think, a lot of good collaboration going on currently, and obviously we need to do more.
Yeah, thank you for that. Just in a minute, Laura, just to note that I'm currently charged within the ICE to come up with some ideas on how we can all learn from each other, rather than this is at an institutional basis as much as at an individual person basis, so that we don't have to keep reinventing different shapes of wheels, etc. Laura.
Yeah, well, it's building on that, to be fair. I think to answer your question of how do we go about this, I think there is a big part of actually, and whether it's data, the language we use, the methods and what we're trying to do it, the tools that we're using for carbon, it can be a little bit of information overload. So we've got more data than we can throw a stick at, but we don't actually use it. As someone rightly said at the beginning, is actually, we've got a shed load of the stuff, but we don't use it. I think it can be quite overwhelming because actually trying to figure out where do you even start is a really big part. So I think from an industry perspective, and it can be valid at all organizational levels, whether it's client, supply chain, etc. And yeah, Costain gets a lot of different demands, but in fairness, our supply chain gets even more of those demands that are even more varied. So I think the consistency in terms of what the language we use, but also simplification. We're really good at overcomplicating net zero for the sake. I mean, it's complicated enough, but we can make it a bit of a dark art. I think there's a real virtue in demystifying what it actually means and keeping it simple. There is nothing wrong with it being simple, and I think the consistency of that is pretty key to making that an industry change and adoption.
Okay, and just thanks to responding to a note that you put on Q&A, Prakash, just really as a reminder that increasingly, of course, we have to consider lifetime and life cycle issues. And just to note that you mentioned BIM, Prakash. Well, increasingly as in the design phase, going through to delivery, and increasingly into operational use, we can take use of BIM techniques. We can ally those now to what are increasingly powerful databases of embedded carbon for different types of materials. Doesn't quite yet answer the modules from Vietnam, but we can get closer to that. And I think I'm beginning to see a number of infrastructure customers really starting to get into life cycle issues, which is really quite different than maybe even 3 or 4 years ago. Right, we have 13 or 14 minutes left to Q&A, so there's still plenty of time for people to come up with new questions.
Can I ask a question to the other panelists?
Yes.
So one of the things we developed business cases for infrastructure that schemes that will be built in decades to come. So big rail projects that will be built in the 2030s. And obviously our cost analysts are developing costs for those and looking at designs, but we don't really know what technological material solutions will be available to us in the 2030s. How do you think we should approach that type of uncertainty? I've talked a bit about travel demand uncertainty, but in terms of technological uncertainty on the construction side, are there any tips you could provide?
I would have one, which is just around, which actually is something that we always say, if you're trying to plan long term, it's very, very difficult. I think one of the best things you could do, and it goes back to some excellent comments that I thought you made, Tim, on you said data analytics are the grammar, and you made some very good comments on the importance of good data management. I would think it's embedding this culture of very good data management and kind of the idea of an overarching data strategy that you're going to use to assess the kind of carbon case, if you like, that's quite technology agnostic, really, that allows you quite a lot of flexibility, but does make a couple of big assumptions. Number one, that you have to be compliant. Number two, that you need the right procurement and kind of contracting models to deliver on your strategy. And number three, that you are really encouraging collaboration and data sharing from the outset. But I loved Lyra's comments about the simplicity of data. I was thinking about data management, and this is again something that we're discovering on building safety, defining what are the key components of your carbon safety case and just really honing in on those and making sure that you've got absolutely excellent data management and data integrity around those, not boiling the ocean, but just around the specific parts, I think is absolutely key.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Anyone else? Laura?
Prakash.
And then Prakash.
Okay. Yes, I was probably building on what Anne-Marie said. I think a key part is, whilst no one knows the answer to what the solution is going to be necessarily by 2030, although probably some informed ideas, I think it's shaping it into the contracts around ensuring that there's that flexibility to actually incorporate innovation when it becomes available. I know that I've certainly been in situations where actually it's not a case of unwillingness from individuals or organizations, but it's actually the inflexibility of how contracts been worded. And I think there's a way of, whilst maintaining that sort of assurance piece, there's a way of building in or incorporating that. Specifications is kind of the same vein, actually really focusing on specifying the carbon reduction outcome, not the specific of how you're going to do it, but the output rather. So I think there's a big way of helping at least drive that innovation as it progresses and sort of becomes available is through the contracts and the specifications that clients have personally.
Thanks, Prakash.
Maybe two thoughts on this. I'll borrow one from a lot of the industrial stuff that we do, is the notion of pre-investment. A classic example is, do I provide the tie-ins on my industrial plant for using CCUS down the line? I don't have the technology available today. It may become available tomorrow. Do I just build my plant as is, or do I actually make the provision, the plot plan space and the tie-ins available, which is going to take money to potentially put that technology in, right? And the way to think about the valuation thereof is basically a real option value, which is I can actually value the option thereof. And so, that leads me to the second point, which is we absolutely hate single point NPVs or single point values of projects because they're not real. They simply don't exist. But in that kind of getting to a distribution or a set of scenarios and actually understanding what's on the downside and the upside, and then really driving, particularly on the things like carbon and additional costs, to actually, I would argue, lower costs when we get there. How do you actually work that out of the kind of tail of the distribution of where you want to come to, right? And then in terms of the practice of actually executing, many of these final choices need to be made much later. And one of the things that we're fighting across the industry are these very rigid stage gates, which, were introduced, 30, 40 years ago to manage risk, but have become very bureaucratic in their nature. And what we're finding to be far more effective is really understanding the risks I want to manage and the key decisions I need to make, and understanding the appropriate point to make those decisions rather than at a stage gate. And that gives you a lot more flexibility and agility. So it requires a much deeper understanding, but once you've got that understanding of the project, you can be a lot more agile in the way you think about the decision-making and the execution.
Yep, thanks. And I think a word from myself on that, Jack. I mean, we don't know what the future will bring us, right? You know, we didn't think 2 years ago that we'd have had the last 15 months or so that we have. Hopefully not another 15 months of the same. I think, how do you look ahead? Well, the government used to run, indeed, I led one or two of them, going back 20 years ago, a number of foresight report areas. And so I would strongly suggest looking at things in an integrated and holistic way, but developing some different scenarios of the future and using those to guide your thinking in terms of the development and or maintenance of policies. Yeah. We've got another 5 or 6 minutes. I've got 2 particular questions remaining that I'd like to see answered. 1, 2, if I can, hang on, I need to find the question here. There is one which I'm going to use as a question to everyone for fairly quick comments, but here's a question for you, Prakash, and yes, I am picking on you because the rest of us are all in the UK, but when you look beyond the UK, and you're perhaps in a much better position to do this than some of the rest of us, what good initiatives are you seeing in governments or indeed private sector clients on projects?
So, you know, in governments, we're seeing a lot, depending on where they are, obviously, and, you know, with recent changes in certain countries, you know, things are moving ahead in the right direction, I'd argue. But we're definitely starting to see in infrastructure projects in particular, this notion of whole life cycle estimation and understanding up front. We're also seeing this kind of spill into kind of the reinsurance industry. And the financing industry, because people are starting to worry a lot more about the sustainability of the money going into these projects. So, you know, if you're building a set of infrastructure in Florida, which is going to have higher incidence of hurricanes versus building it somewhere else, which is going to have heat waves, you know, you need to actually start thinking about the long-term climate effects, on the impact of that on your investment and potential insurance risk. And so we're starting to see a lot of activity in the finance space, actually driving some of the requirements to understand this, simply because people want to actually start protecting their money, knowing that change is coming. So, you know, we're seeing that positive move. We're seeing in almost all of the major, you know, oil and gas and mining producers and chemicals players, a very different way of thinking about whole life cycle cost. They don't have an answer to it yet, but from 2 years ago, much more actively asking the question, how do we tackle this? We need to tackle it. And so, you know, almost across the board, we're seeing a very positive dialogue around this. And then obviously there's all of the, you know, the kind of new energy stuff and the energy transition stuff. You know, how do we think about enabling hydrogen? How do we think about, you know, coupling hydrogen and solar and wind and renewable energy systems? And you know, linking that then through to kind of, okay, how do we deliver these projects? How do we come together as ecosystems of partners and moving away from, you know, kind of almost bimodal or kind of bilateral owner kind of prime contractor model, because that's actually not going to work for the energy transition. So how do we think a lot more holistically around, you know, ecosystems of partners that need to play together, etc. So a lot of very positive dialogue. Also, you know, geared towards changing the way we deliver projects as opposed to the traditional way of delivering projects, because that's at the heart of a lot of this, is we deliver projects really badly and incredibly inefficiently. And actually, if we could just strip out some of the waste, we could do this all 30% faster and 30% cheaper, and that gives you a 30% faster energy transition and allows you to do, you know, a lot more with the same funds, right? So net, that's a win for everybody. And that dialogue is definitely starting to happen.
Okay, thanks very much. We've got 3 minutes left. So this last question, I'm going to ask to each of you in turn, and please give a very quick answer. This is sort of top of the head answer. Question from Donnie McNichol. From a project and specifically data perspective, what one action do you believe project professionals can take that would make the carbon reduction? start with you, Anne-Marie. I can see you nodding. That's good or bad side.
I think it goes back to what I said before about having a data strategy in place, both at corporate level and at project level.
Okay, thank you. Jack?
I think it's seeing how the project fits into the big picture. So if it's a part of a program, what does the program do for carbon overall? How does it interact with other sectors? What's happening on the energy side? What's happening on the transport side? How are those different kind of external factors influencing carbon, not just narrowly looking at the project, but thinking about the energy system that it sits within overall. Okay,
thank you. Karen?
I would say it's recognising that as a project professional, they need to really get to their data and really understand that they are the conduit for making it happen. They need to be sourcing and accessing the information that is there and getting hot on the way that they manage data and information within their project.
Thank you. Laura?
I'd say regardless of what profession you do within a project, is being informed of what's genuinely within your gift of influence and then focusing on that. So understanding actually where can you play the biggest part. So being informed.
Thank you. And Prakash?
Very similar to Laura, I would flip this costing, designing costing thing on its head. Start with the drivers, start with your understanding, and then design on the back of that. You'll get a much better outcome, not just on the carbon footprint, but across the entire project.
Okay, thanks. And for me, and for those of you who know me well, I'm almost bound to say this. I would say that getting in place some robust but workable, pragmatic standards on project data analytics and getting bits and then increasingly more parts of industry to take them up would give us this sort of lingua franca or whatever. Anything but the Tower of Babel. Okay, thank you, panel. Thank you, questioners. Thank you, those members of the panel who gave presentations before. I'm now going to invite Mark Coates from Bentley Systems to close the webinar.
Thank you, Tim. It's just very much a personal thanks to everybody for not only taking part from the speakers, but also the people who did the survey and the contributors who helped form the survey, because papers like this don't actually have the impact that is needed in industry unless they have that industry support. And of course, my biggest thanks go out to Jonathan and to Andy at MPA for allowing us to do this. With that in mind, we're actually looking at doing another paper on the Q3, Q4 of this year, and that's going to be very much involved around capability from a personal point of view and not a technical point of view. So staffing levels, mindsets, direction, etc. So if you would like to get involved, please do let me know or let Jonathan know at MPA, and we'd welcome your ability to give an opinion. So thank you all.